Hello and welcome to Aston Originals. Today we're talking degree apprenticeships, how degree apprenticeships are making UK PLC more competitive. I'm joined by Terry Hodgetts. Terry, hello. Would you just like to introduce yourself to begin with?
Hi Sam, good afternoon. Yeah, I'm the Director of Corporate Client Solutions at Aston University. So I look after the team responsible for all of the management of degree apprenticeships across our portfolio and the large in-company training programs that we run for some of our major clients.
Now, it is National Apprenticeship Week this week from the 7th of February for that week. We're talking about degree apprenticeships. Can you just tell us what a degree apprenticeship is?
Sure. Apprenticeships have been around, as most people know, for a very, very long time now. But what happened around 2016, 2017 was a transition from what used to be known as apprenticeship frameworks to the new apprenticeship standards. And at that time, there were two major changes that came through. The first was that the government allowed apprenticeships to move further through the qualification structure than before. So whereas previously apprenticeships were mostly associated with level 2, level 3, level 4 kinds of approaches, we were now able to run apprenticeships up to level 6, which is the equivalent of a bachelor's degree, and to level 7 up to master's degree. And then the second thing, of course, was the introduction of the apprenticeship levy, which meant that every large company with a payroll of over £3 million per annum was paying that levy into a pot, which allowed them to draw the funds down to fund the apprenticeships that they operate in their business.
Excellent, very concise. And now we're going to break this down into 4 sections. You've done a lot of legwork for me, so I thank you for that. We're going to look at the impact on the talent pipeline, apprenticeship benefits, key actions for success, and then at the end we're going to tie it in with busting some misconceptions. So I guess we'll start with impact on the talent pipeline. You've got in some of these notes that graduate retention was stable until 2014, but it's declined ever since. So let's just start with that if you can.
Yeah, if we sort of look at the employment marketplace and we look at the trends that have happened over the last few years, the Association of Graduate Recruiters has noticed that graduate retention has been increasingly challenging in the last few years. And I think this ties into what we've seen in business in UK PLC and internationally over the past 10, 15, 20 years, the change in the psychological contract, people having multiple careers, people moving and changing regularly. But that decline year on year is particularly significant when you bear in mind that, typically speaking, 16% of graduate entrants to a business will leave within the first 2 years, and 46% of them will leave within the first 5 years. Now, if we think of this from a talent perspective, it's expensive, it's time consuming to recruit people into the business. And lots of employers for many years have run graduate programs where they've been recruiting university leavers and taking them into the business. And that's still a very valuable activity that companies can do. But there is pressure on that market, partly because of the tendency for those graduates to want to move, partly because of the tendency and the continued growth of skills shortages in certain critical areas. So we're seeing, for example, in the tech sector, in the engineering sector, it's proving very difficult for organizations to recruit graduates because there just aren't enough of them around. They're having to pay a premium to bring them on board. And then the challenge of onboarding and retaining them and keeping them in the business is always difficult because there's somebody else looking for them. And I think this is why so many employers are looking now to running apprenticeships programs and school leaver programs instead of just graduate programs on their own. And we've seen in the news, I think just in the last week, Amazon have announced they're recruiting 1,500 apprentices in the UK, including 200 at degree level. One of our own clients is in deep discussions with us at the moment and planning to launch a school leaver program later this year. So we are seeing this shift towards targeting school leavers as opposed to targeting university leavers. I don't think the graduate recruitment market goes away in that context, but it's another tool in the toolkit for organizations that want to build that talent pipeline.
It does sound like a sort of like a seller's market if you are the person selling yourself in this instance.
I think it is, definitely. And that's what makes the retention of staff such a critical issue, because they are expensive to recruit. Companies do invest a lot up front to bring the people on board. And therefore, the longer they can hold on to them, the more they can promote from within, the better off they are. And for example, we're seeing data from the Skills Funding Agency that tells us that 80% of employers that have invested in apprenticeships are seeing an increase in staff retention as a result of that, which is saying to me that there's a definite benefit for organizations in terms of keeping their people on board, reducing their recruitment costs, and getting more impact out of the investment that they're making.
And just some of those areas where we're seeing those shortages at the moment, I mean, it will ebb and flow, won't it, as time goes by? But at the moment, what sort of areas are we looking at?
Well, as I mentioned, engineering and technology are always a challenge. And when we look at what's happening, just in the business world, with the growth of tech companies, with the extraordinary share prices of tech stocks, and all of the challenges that businesses are facing with regard to cybersecurity, with regard to the shift of marketing platforms and campaigns more and more into the virtual world and away from sort of traditional bricks and mortar type marketing, then there's an ever-growing demand for these kinds of skills in that marketplace, and it's very, very challenging to fill those slots. In the case of engineering, and particularly in some subsectors of engineering, we're seeing the same thing. There's a shortage of trained and qualified engineers. So organizations are needing to get much more savvy and much lighter on their feet to think about how are they going to find them, how are they going to retain them. And in many ways, perhaps the simplest answer for them to solve these problems is to grow their own rather than keep looking outside.
Let's have a look at the second pillar, as it were, which is the apprenticeship benefits. And we're almost talking about retention again, but in this case, it's for the duration of the apprenticeship that seems to stick out in this case.
Yeah, and I think the duration of the apprenticeship and the sort of the habits and the familiarity almost that comes about as a result of that is a key part of the benefit for organizations. So, one of the issues to think about is, and let's take the case as an example of an apprentice that's done, for the sake of argument, a chartered manager degree apprenticeship. So they've been with the business for 3 years. They come out at the end of it with a degree in business, with Chartered Manager Institute membership, but they are also coming out with 3 years of experience. They've been imbued with the company culture. They've got to know the people in the organizations. They've probably done several jobs and had multiple different assignments. They know the organization. They've built their personal impact and brand. They've demonstrated their contribution to the business. They feel part of the organization. So the employment relationship is a relationship at that point, and that relationship is built up. Whereas if you recruit a person that's coming out as a business graduate, you have to start that relationship from day one, from scratch. So that sense of belonging, that sense of familiarity, that sense of shared understanding of culture and behaviors and the organization and the individual, I think is a really powerful lever to help to retain and bring people in and help them to commit, at least for some time, to the organization that they're working with.
Does it almost fix that problem that, I mean, I was talking to my friends about this, sort of 10 years ago, and you like putting your CV together and all that sort of stuff. And it's the whole thing about experience and qualifications. And this seems to almost plug the gap or at least tick both boxes in that instance.
Absolutely. If we think about the careers advice that we give to our undergraduates when they're going out into the job market, more and more we're encouraging them to think about how they can present their extracurricular experience, how they can talk about the societies they've been in, the voluntary jobs they've done, the live experiences that they've been able to collect. It isn't just about demonstrating the intellectual competence that a degree gives you, but it's those skills and behaviors that you accrue through the process that are so important. And of course, with an apprenticeship, those skills and behaviors, in addition to the knowledge, are baked into that learning process over the duration of the program.
And why else do you think that people are deciding to stay? Because, experience is great, but not all experience is good experience. So there must be other factors playing a part in that. Absolutely.
And I think one of the critical elements, and it again goes back in some ways, I think, to the concept of the psychological contract. Anybody going into the job market is thinking about it in the terms of, what's in it for me? What's the benefits to me of taking this job and doing this role? Now, if somebody's been through a degree apprenticeship with an employer, they've got that evidence in front of them of career progression, in many cases multiple promotions over the course of their apprenticeship. They've seen the organization investing in and taking time and investing effort in developing them as an individual and as a professional. So they're seeing this much more as a partnership as opposed to an exchange of labor for wages. It's much more symbiotic in the way that it operates. So there is a proof of concept for a degree apprentice when they come out at the end of their degree that says, actually, I've been with this business for a while. They've developed me, they've mentored me, they've given me opportunities for growth, they've broadened my understanding and my learning, they've built my network, they've generated much greater professional confidence on my part, and they've given me an opportunity to grow my profile and build my personal brand. This is an organization that invests in its people. It's worth sticking around and seeing how far I can go.
And we've been highlighting sort of networking as well. I don't know whether coronavirus and the pandemic has highlighted the need for especially young people to start creating those networks in a professional environment where, you know, a lot of us are still working from home, although at the time recording the guidance has changed. How important would a degree apprenticeship be in actually starting to build up those networks again? Because it could be a little bit harder, arguably, than it would have been sort of pre-2020.
I think it's hugely important, and I think it's hugely important for two reasons. The first, if I may sound like a slightly old fuddy-duddy, is
those are your words.
Absolutely,
your
they're my words. But relationships get built face-to-face, person-to-person. It's about getting to know people, and we can do a lot online, and we are, such as with this podcast. We do a great deal online. We're doing a lot with our teaching online, but in my view, there is no substitute for building those personal relationships and building those personal contacts. So having a learning journey that is structured in a way to facilitate that, even if it is having to take place largely virtually because of COVID, is going to add a great deal of value. The second thing is even more important, and that is networking isn't just about collecting business cards and getting to know people. Networking is a skill. You need to learn how to make contact, how to engage in conversation, how to show an appropriate interest in the person that you're dealing with, how to go there with an open mind and a sense of giving and what can I do to help this person without necessarily wanting anything for myself. That's how we build networks. And that skill is best served in an environment where there is a structure that allows for opportunities where those networking activities can take place. So in the case of a degree apprenticeship, when the group comes together and they're in their classroom training, they're chatting over coffee, maybe they're going for a drink in the evening and getting to know each other. Within their organizational setting, quite often, there'll be meetup groups or internal cohorts and networks that their employer is facilitating, so they get to meet senior executives. They learn how to conduct themselves and comport themselves in that environment. So it's building a lot of these tacit skills that are so important to people as they go through their career, and which historically perhaps we've not given as much attention to as we could have done.
It's really interesting. We've sort of maybe touched on a couple of points for sort of key actions for success. But what else in that area of what we're talking about today can you talk about? Well,
in the conversations that we have with employers, and as you can imagine, I have quite a lot of conversations with employers about these sorts of things now. I think there are certain key activities and key objectives that employers need to set for themselves in supporting apprenticeship programs, which can really help them to drive these effectively and make them work more effectively. So the first thing to think about is the onboarding, the engagement of the apprentices when you bring them on board. Most companies have induction processes and maybe they'll run a few little sessions, but thinking about what they can do to really engage the apprentices up front, and in an ideal world, get some senior managers involved with them from the outset and show that the senior managers are invested in this and caring about it, because that opens the apprentices' eyes. They think, this company's serious. I want to stick with these people because they really are investing in it. And then think about it in terms of the progression pathways and the milestones. It isn't good enough to bring an apprentice on board and say, right, you're a degree apprentice, go and do your program now, and we'll see you every 3 months. Engage with them, work with them, make sure that there's a shared plan between the employer and the apprentice and with the support of the learning provider to make that happen. So that, I think, is the first thing. The second thing is to really focus hard on the line managers and the mentors in the business, because they've got a critical role to support the apprentice in developing their skills and applying their knowledge. And we need to make sure that the line managers are on message, that they're engaged in this process, that they understand the value of it, and they are committing to supporting that activity, particularly with regard to the 20% off the job, which I think we'll come to shortly. But just in terms of supporting that apprentice in their journey in the organization and making sure they're doing the right things and saying the right things as they go through that process.
Is there a company, sorry to interrupt there, is there a company that you have in sort of the back of your mind? I don't want to drop it in on you like this, but I'm going to anyway, that has that sort of the best practice, and you go, actually, that's exactly how this should be working. Is there a business out there that you think actually they've got it pretty much spot on?
Oh, there are several, and I'm nervous to name any particular one, because there'd be a lot of employers that I deal with that might be offended that I didn't mention them. You know, it's a bit like an Oscar speech. You thank everybody and then you miss a few out. But yeah, it's. I mean, for example, you know, there's one client that we're working with. I won't mention the name of the client, but we're running a program for them, which it's actually at level 7, not at level 6. And what they've done, it's a slightly different spin. So instead of having a graduate program, they've turned the graduate program into an apprenticeship program to do a master's degree. So their commercial graduates are coming in and going through a structured learning journey to going towards a master's degree as part of that process. So they're doing all of these things. We've got deep engagement with the apprenticeship leads in the business. Their line managers are really closely connected. We've got a very focused activity between our own skills coaches that support the apprentices on program and the line managers in the business that do that. The program content itself is developed in consultation with senior executive sponsors for the different program areas. So when they're discussing strategy, a strategy director comes along, has a conversation with them, does a Q&A, maybe joins them for dinner, has, you know, discussions around that. So what we've got is a cohort of people that can see they're being invested in. They're getting exposure to the senior managers of the business. They're understanding much more about the corporate context as a result of that. And this is building this kind of virtuous circle of engagement and development as we take them through the process. Now, there are a lot of employers that are taking similar action to that. Some of them do it in a very independent way within their own organization. Some of them do it very closely in partnership with us. But I think the critical thing is it shouldn't just be a transaction or a training course. It needs to be really embedded in the way that we do business and the way that we develop our staff.
Anything more to add on the key actions for success?
Well, yeah, definitely think about making sure that you're following up on structured reviews and make sure you're regularly checking on the apprentice's progress. It's very easy to let that slip and say, oh, we're very busy, we'll do it next month. And next month becomes 3 months later. And then momentum is lost and interest is lost. So it's important to stay on top of that. I think monitoring progression and retention is important for organizations. And I remember, again, it's from a slightly different context, but one of our previous corporate clients that we worked with, that we run a middle management program with, every year we'd have one dinner where their HR vice president would fly in and go through the list of the previous year's attendees and tell us which ones had got promoted and how big a pay rise they got and where they were going and all the rest. So celebrating that success, tracking it and seeing that evidence that we're investing in these people and we're getting a payback for it, I think is really important. I think as well, really actively promoting on the job and off the job learning, recognizing the fact that developing knowledge, skills and behavior for an apprenticeship it's part of everybody's job, whether they're on an apprenticeship or not, and being open and engaged and really encouraging about doing that is critical. And then the final thing I'd say is measure the impact. So look at your staff retention rates. If you're reducing your staff turnover and retaining staff for longer, you're reducing your recruitment costs. And you can calculate that. You can put a value on it. You can understand how much you're saving. You can look at the cost of promoting from inside as opposed to going outside to recruit. And that's a bottom line cost that you're saving for the business. And then a big thing with apprenticeships, just about every apprenticeship standard has some kind of work-based project as part of the endpoint assessment. That project should be on a live activity. It should be having an impact on the business. You should be able to manage that and measure it and see the value coming back in. And again, going back to that organization that we worked with previously, it wasn't just the HR vice president that used to stand up and boast. Every year we'd run projects as part of that management development program. And every year we'd be able to identify, in a bad year, it was £1.5 million per annum of bottom line benefit to the business from the projects that were done as part of the program. So it is an investment that is paying back. We're not just training our people because it's a good thing to do. It's adding value to the business. And anything organizations can do to measure that, monitor it and report on it, it's going to help the apprenticeships leads and the HR people make the case. It's going to help the business understand the value of it. It's going to encourage the senior managers to buy in even more and give it more support.
Really good point. It's the old adage, isn't it, that time is money, but finding time to actually stop, even though you're busy, and evaluate these things is really important.
Yeah,
let's move on to the fourth bit that we've got in my spider diagram, which is the busting some misconceptions. So we're going to do some myth busting here. We've got 3 that you put together, which I think ones that you're asked a lot in your role about often. The first one is, how can we accommodate 20% off the job learning? It's too onerous and costly. Firstly, for people that maybe aren't aware, I know we've mentioned it previously in this video, but that 20% to begin with.
The 20% is a regulatory requirement for every apprenticeship. It is a requirement that the apprentice is able to evidence that they spend 20% of their time in what the regulator calls off-the-job learning. So this is not doing their day job, but it's developing the knowledge, skills, and behaviors that are defined in the apprenticeship standard. Now, that seems awful. That, to an employer, they sit there and think, hang on, I'm recruiting these people, I'm employing them 5 days a week, but I'm only getting 4 days a week of work out of them. That can sound terrible, especially when we think back to what apprenticeships used to be, and it was all day release and block release and individuals going to technical college. But that's not what this is about. Different employers approach this challenge differently. Some of them will formally allocate structured study time. They'll maybe have an internal agreement with their apprentices that say you can do half a day a week or a couple of days a month or whatever it might be. Others will just accommodate it within the flow of an individual's job role. Some industries, it's relatively easy to plan for these things. Other industries, for example, hospitality and entertainment, it can be very difficult because there are such peaks and troughs in business activity. There are times when it's very difficult to spend time developing knowledge, skills, and behaviors because you've got customers queuing out the door. So it's about managing that process over the duration of the apprenticeship and not just 1 week at a time or 1 day at a time. But there are lots of things that count. It isn't just sitting in a classroom. It isn't just reading books. So let's imagine an apprentice on a marketing apprenticeship goes and spends a week with the sales team, shadowing the sales team to see how they operate and how the marketing campaigns hit the ground and operate in the real world. That's 1 week of off-the-job training. You can link that directly back to the knowledge, skills, and behaviors of the apprenticeship, and all of that counts towards the 20% potentially. Or let's think about a digital technology solutions apprentice that goes to an industry conference talking about change management in IT projects. Critical skills, absolutely important, link back to the apprenticeship standard and count towards the 20%. All of us in our professional jobs occasionally go to conferences and seminars and webinars. These things count. Or another example, a chartered manager apprentice who's in year 3 of their chartered manager degree apprenticeship. And let's imagine that their employer has decided within their talent program that apprentices in year 3 of their chartered manager program spend part of their time mentoring first-year apprentices in their chartered manager program. Perfect example, developing leadership skills, coaching skills, and all the rest of it. That counts towards the 20%. So there's lots and lots of different ways to do it. There's just one critical question that employers need to check, which is, does this activity link back to the knowledge, skills, and behaviors defined in the apprenticeship standard? If it does, capture it, evidence it, count it.
A degree apprenticeship isn't really as good / prestigious as a degree. I bet you get that quite a lot. Is that one of the most common ones?
Yeah, and I think, to be fair, we're getting it less now. Certainly in the early days of degree apprenticeships, there was this thought that, well, it's not truly an academic degree because it's an apprenticeship and therefore it's not to the same standards. But I think slowly we're getting over that issue. The first and most important thing to say is that if somebody's doing a degree apprenticeship, a degree is part of the apprenticeship, and it's to the same standards, the same academic rigor, measuring the same outputs as an undergraduate degree or postgraduate degree would be. And, if we think about this in the context of, equivalence in the marketplace, for example, for many years, the most prestigious business degree in the business marketplace is an MBA. And an MBA is a highly practical master's degree in management. So in many ways, the MBA is to master's degrees what degree apprenticeships are to standard degrees. The application of the knowledge, skills, and behavior is the critical issue. And if I think back to my own personal experience, I did a business degree as my first degree a long time ago. And when I came out of that business degree, I knew a lot. But once I started my job and I started to learn about marketing campaigns and how they actually worked, and I started to understand the ins and outs of performance management and organizational communication, and I started to get a grip on budgeting. I didn't just know them, I understood them. It's taking knowledge and turning it into wisdom almost through that experience. And the beauty of the degree apprenticeship approach is you do get that academic rigor, it's delivered to the same standards, but at the same time, while you're learning on the degree, you have the opportunity to connect that knowledge to live experience and build that understanding. So by the end of it, a degree apprentice coming out with their DA, with their endpoint assessment, doesn't just have the degree level competence of understanding the concepts and the tools and the theories, they have the practical understanding of how to use it and how it works in the marketplace.
Really, really interesting. And it just shows how far it's come in what is, I think, relatively a short space of time.
Yeah.
Just finally then, what is endpoint assessment and why is it so important? Surely the degree is award enough?
The degree is a very valuable award, there's no question in that. But the endpoint assessment is a really critical element in terms of the apprenticeship journey, because while the degree recognizes the academic achievement, it's the endpoint assessment that is providing the check mark against the knowledge, skills, and behaviors that have been defined as important by the employers who set up the apprenticeship standard in the first place. So this is the watermark that says this is actually a valuable qualification and activity for people in this profession with this qualification. It's the way that the apprentice proves that they can apply what they've learned in an organizational context, and they can evidence that application. They can show that they've done it and they've implemented the knowledge, skills, and behaviors that they've learned. And it often also carries an additional badge from a professional statutory regulatory body. So, maybe an engineering council or the Chartered Management Institute or the Institute of Marketing. So the professional bodies add their weight to the apprenticeship qualification through the endpoint assessment to give it even greater credibility. It enhances individual career prospects, it enhances people's professional profiles, and demonstrates and confirms not just academic competence, but professional competence as part of the process. And again, usually the endpoint assessment will include an applied project element, which is an opportunity to deliver value to the business, generate a return on investment, solve problems, improve processes, and all the rest. So there's lots of value to the endpoint assessment in addition to the degree that I think it's very important that employers and apprentices keep sight on as they go through that journey.
Really, really interesting stuff, Terry. For those who have sort of been listening to the last half an hour or so and think, actually, I want to find out a little bit more, not that you haven't covered enough in that half an hour time, but how can they get in touch and who is it best to talk to?
It's easy to just go onto our website, apprenticeships at aston.ac.uk is the email address, or look on the Aston website. We've got a link to our apprenticeship pages from our homepage. Google is your friend on this. I was doing a session last week for a group of school leavers at a careers fair and just pointing them in the direction of, just some of the links that are out there on the internet for job postings, for different activities, for learning and knowledge and all the rest of it. But in terms of Aston, we've got our websites on the Aston website, and it's apprenticeships@aston.ac.uk is our inbox for all of the apprenticeship related activity.
And then someone will be in touch. Perfect. Well, thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have a good National Apprenticeship Week.
We're looking forward to it. Thank you, Sam.